Hello again, and welcome to what I believe is the eighth video for the lecture series on logic and critical thinking. Again, I'm Calvin Andrassi, and today we're going to be thinking about morality and ethics and the application of critical thinking in helping to develop a moral, ethical code that one can live by and that they can apply in their day-to-day um, professional and other aspects of their life, essentially. Okay, so we want to start with discussing the fact that moral issues and decisions are indeed very complex. They can be a little bit challenging to navigate, so it takes a little bit of critical thought to be able to discern what elements of morality are important to consider. Um, and what one needs to reflect on in order to be able to build a moral code that is valuable, applicable, and accurate. Okay, so critical thinking is all about developing enlightening values or enlightened values. Um, Using informed moral reasoning and drawing ethical conclusions about different types of situations. So ethics and morality ultimately help us to try to determine how the world ought to be and what courses of action people should take in order to essentially achieve those kinds of goals. Okay. So morals are basically the basis for determining core principles and evaluating concepts like what is right and wrong, good and bad, or good and evil, what is just and unjust, what is considered fair and unfair, and ultimately what makes a person responsible or irresponsible as far as their actions are concerned. Meanwhile, ethics is sort of a subdivision of morality. Ethics are essentially the application of those kinds of principles, usually within a certain type of context or role or situation that you might find yourself in. And it relates to the kinds of relationships that you ultimately share with others. Okay. So with ethics, you have both prescriptions for certain behaviors and prohibitions against others. So in depending on the role that you ultimately take on, you have to consider and behave in certain ways and refrain from behaving in other ways. So as examples of the kinds of roles you can potentially take on, there are different types of research related ethics, such as providing individuals with an appropriate amount of information so that you can get positive consent to participate in whatever research study you're looking at. There are also business and legal ethics, rules and, again, prescriptions for and prohibitions against certain types of behaviors that could result in things like unfair advantages or might be in violation of certain types of legal principles. Okay. So, as far as morality is concerned, it comes from a lot of different sources, right? So, there are a number of different institutions that ultimately help a person define what their moral values ultimately are. First, and perhaps chief among them, is the family, particularly one's parents or guardians. As young children, we oftentimes emulate the behaviors of the individuals in our immediate family, and that ultimately serves as the basis for our moral decision making as well. Okay. Other sources, right? Formally, teachers in schools try to help students define their moral values. A big part of the philosophy behind education, going all the way back to its beginnings with the ancient Greeks, um, is the general notion that education should be capable of producing uh, thoughtful and moral and upstanding citizens within a society. Okay, so teachers do indeed help push their students along that path. Of course, we have our friends and colleagues as well. To many individuals, religious leaders are a source of morality. And oftentimes that comes with a number of different religious texts, right? Um, for example, the Bible, um, or the Quran and the Bhagavad Gita, depending on the religious tradition, perhaps, that a person is born into. And of course, sometimes we also look to other authorities as the basis for determining what is moral, and what is not. Perhaps some people look at the various types of philosophers on the concepts of morality and ethics, or they look to leaders in their community. Perhaps some people will look at the President of the United States as a source of moral authority, or perhaps looking at a leader in some other country as inspiration for how to behave under certain circumstances. And of course, historical and prominent figures, perhaps looking at Dr. Martin Luther King or Mahatma Gandhi as individuals who are upstanding moral individuals that might help guide decision making on certain types of matters. Right? But thinking critically ultimately calls for a person to be very self reflective. And in so doing, they're able to develop a very refined and hopefully, like I said before, applicable and accurate kind of moral compass that will help them to ultimately make the most moral decisions that they possibly can. Okay. Now, I do teach a class on moral philosophy, and we do discuss a great number of different moral philosophers, starting all the way back with individuals like Hammurabi, who wrote the first code of laws in civilized society that we have a record of. Moving forward to the ancient Greeks, which are particularly um, significant in guiding Western ethical and moral philosophies. We look at some of the Roman thinkers, especially the Stoics. We look at early Christian religious thinkers because of the significant impact they had in Europe, which subsequently came to the United States as well to a pretty significant degree. And then, of course, Enlightenment philosophy changed a lot of the major ideas in determining and influencing the decision making of individuals that are hoping to act in a moral way. And then, specific to the United States, we look at some of the founding fathers and their perspectives on what it essentially is to be a good American. Again, under the assumption that individuals that would be taking my class would be in the United States, of course. Okay. So, there are very many different perspectives and nuances in establishing the moral codes that people will ultimately subscribe to, essentially. So some things that you might want to think about in that regard, if you're trying to come up with your own moral code. First and foremost, the notion of free will versus fate, right? Do we actually have free will? Do we make our choices based on our own capacity to do so? And does our ability to think freely and act influence that, or are we more so the product of a really immutable past that's exerting its influence? You can kind of think of this in terms of maybe a more positivistic or scientific approach to understanding the world around you, looking at themes and trends and just things that do influence the way certain people behave under certain situations. Psychology and sociology are all about determining some of those patterns. Um, that can kind of undermine to a certain degree a person's belief in the notion of free will, where people are making decisions independent of the past influences, perhaps, that have led them to that situation. So, how much weight do you give to either side? Are we just a matter of all the circumstances in our lives? And would somebody be able to predict how we would behave under certain circumstances? Or, is there something deeper to it? Is there something independent of merely the variables that influence our past, that allow us to have free will and free thought and free decision making in choosing what actions to take um, in the context of morality? Okay. Next up, the ideas of relativism versus universalism, right? And this is all about the belief about whether there are universal right and wrong perspectives on things, or if ultimately these positions are socially constructed, right? So if you take, perhaps a classical sociological thinker like Max Weber, who developed the concept of interpretivism, which in his context, he was all about the military, and he was looking at, how do the officers in a military setting interact with the enlisted or conscripted personnel. How do they behave with other officers? How do they behave with civilians and things like that? And a lot of those behaviors are shaped and molded by um, whatever social environment and whatever role they happen to be in at the time, right? So the question is, are morals similarly the product of the interactions and the situations that we find ourselves in? Is it something that society ultimately determines what right and wrong ultimately is, right? You think about the Vikings as an example, where perhaps the greatest good one could possibly achieve was to gloriously die in battle. Is there a degree of universalism in the moral principles from one society to the next? Are there things that you can identify as being present in every society? Or, do societies ultimately construct their own visions of what is right and wrong, and just that there happens to be overlap in different social and civilizational um, uh, locations, and again, geopolitically and otherwise, right? Take, for example, Nazi Germany, where things that would have been deemed to be the actions of a good citizen in Germany during that period would be absolutely abhorrent in other societies. Okay. Next up, consequentialism versus deontology. Okay. And that is basically the idea of, are you bound by the rules? Are you bound by the motivations? Are you bound by the intentions of what you're doing? Or do the outcomes also matter? Right? So, can your actions be moral if their outcomes are bad or come to a bad result? So, does somebody adhere to rules to be a good person, or to ensure a positive outcome? Or do you really need to have some sort of a positive outcome in order for you to actually say that your decision was right? Which of course leads to the questions of things like virtue ethics versus legalism. If you establish yourself a series of priorities in terms of the moral virtues that you adopt, and how you execute them in any given situation, is that more important than following things to the letter of the law, as would be the case with legalism? And then, of course, we go beyond that to the notions of utilitarianism versus egoism, or perhaps altruism versus egoism, right? Um, Philosophers like Jeremy Bentham, for example, uh, discuss morality as providing essentially the greatest good for the greatest number of individuals while minimizing harm, right? And it is sort of the basis of some of the procedural, legal, um, ethical principles that we have for things like government, right? The goal of government is generally to maximize the general welfare of individuals that fall under its jurisdiction. And so there has to be some sort of a code that reflects that. And of course, utilitarianism is central to those kinds of organizational and situational, to a certain degree, uh, principles that needed to be developed, right? But then at the same time, egoism, right? It's not inherently evil to do things for your own benefit, right? If you sit on an airplane, the uh, the airline stewards and stewardesses will take the oxygen mask and always tell you to put on your own mask first before you help other people, right? Because you got to help yourself first, because if you don't do that, in the context of the plane there, what happens if you pass out? Then you're not going to be any help to anybody around you. So always take care of yourself first and then move on to helping other people, right? So then the question is, how much should you help yourself? How far should you take it? Um, you know, uh, Trying to avoid hurting people in the advancement of your own goals might be, a moral uh, topic or idea to reflect upon. Not going all the way to something like hedonism, or perhaps balancing some degree of altruism with the egoism as well. These are things that you have to consider and think about in reflecting upon what it is to be moral. Okay. So here are some useful moral positions that people can take, especially in the context of ethical dilemmas. You know, um, Sometimes you have a conflict between different morals, and you're not exactly sure what the right or the wrong action might be. And of course, different people are going to respond differently regarding what they would do if they were unsure of what is right or wrong. And for that, maybe you want to have some basically heuristical kind of positions um, to work with. Heuristics being kind of shorthand, um, things that help to facilitate decision making, so that in certain situations you can make decisions a little bit faster than maybe sitting down and self-reflecting for 2 hours before you decide whether or not to take some sort of an action, right? So some of these positions, I would follow my conscience, right? Some people have a bit of an intuition about what is considered to be right and wrong. Do you follow that intuition? I do not know what I would do is a perfectly valid legal position to have, or sorry, moral position to have when faced with some sort of an ethical dilemma, right? And a lot of people do kind of get stuck and are unable to determine what action to ultimately take under certain situations. I would do whatever to improve my own situation, right? That's more of an egoistical position to take, right? Again, make sure that you're doing all right so that then you can help people in return. I would do what God or the scriptures say is right, right? A lot of people base their morality on some sort of a religious background, some sort of a religious code. And some people have the belief that there are supernatural entities that are guiding the events on Earth. So perhaps those individuals would take solace in the perhaps the various texts that are associated with that, or some of the basic moral and ethical principles therein. So again, you have like the Torah and the Bible in the Judeo-Christian perspective. You have the Quran in Islam. You have the Bhagavad Gita in Hinduism, which is all about duty. Um, and beyond just texts and things like that, the idea of the eightfold path and the noble truths and things like that from Buddhism. There are lots of different religious perspectives and religious paradigms that can be applied to morality as well. Another option is I would do whatever made me happy. Again, kind of in that same vein as egoism. Whatever it is that results in a positive result for you. I would follow the advice of an authority, such as a parent or teacher, right? If you can't make a moral decision, perhaps you turn to somebody else to help you make that decision. And then last but certainly not least, I would do what is best for everyone involved. That's more of the utilitarian sort of perspective, try to maximize the good to the most number of people. Okay. Now again, this is about thinking about morality. So let's think about moral decision making itself, right? So in thinking critically about morals, you have to really make morality a priority. It has to be something that you want to dedicate yourself to, right? You can't you can't half-heartedly accept a moral set of principles. Otherwise, you're pretty much bound to opening the doors of acting in an immoral way, right? So you have to be aware of the moral issues and make decisions that are ultimately going to be based on reflection and persuasive reasoning, right? If you're going to be a critical thinker, you need to have some sort of a basis in logic, in rationale, in evidence that makes you adopt a particular moral position. And you have to kind of think about it and put yourself into the shoes of somebody that needs to make some sort of a moral decision in order to figure out how you would ultimately decide to act and how things would probably play out as a result of that. So remember that ethics are ultimately grounded in reason, right? The logic of ethical statements are rooted in reasons and evidence rather than simply how you feel about it, just mere emotions, right? And again, ethical statements are intended to be universal in their application. Now, I'm not necessarily saying that morals are universal, but as far as the ethical and moral statements that a person gives or makes, the idea is that an individual would act in a certain type of way that is universal based on the circumstances and follow that ethical principle or moral principle to its end. Okay, so some other considerations. Consider the ethics of justice and care as primary ethics that guide your moral compass, right? Immanuel Kant, who was an Enlightenment philosopher, kind of seen as the father of the more deontological perspective on morality, says that people should always be treated as the ends and not the means, and that was sort of a criticism of Niccolo Machiavelli, who, while he didn't say it himself, is associated with the statement of the ends justifying the means, right? So Immanuel Kant would probably suggest that even if the end result isn't as positive as you would want it to be, if at least you didn't act in a harmful way, it might be better than actually having a good result on the other end. Whereas Niccolo Machiavelli, he wrote a treatise, if you will, called The Prince, after his he was an advisor to the leaders in, I believe it was Florence, prior to the unification of Italy. And Cesare Borgia was the individual that led the military assault against the Medici family that was overthrown, leaving Niccolo Machiavelli to essentially be exiled from Florence. So, in order to try to make friends with Cesare Borgia, he wrote this treatise called The Prince, which is all about Cesare Borgia, talking about how a leader needs to basically do everything that Cesare Borgia did, be ruthless, have spies everywhere, and the notion that it's better to be feared than to be loved, right? Immanuel Kant kind of turned that argument on its head a couple of hundred years later, and was more focused on making sure that you treat people fairly and empathetically, um, rather than using them as tools to achieve whatever it is that you need to achieve. Okay. Other things to consider: accountability and responsibility, right? In order to be held accountable and responsible for good and bad choices, the actions have to be the result of free choices and not merely accidental. So, in determining what is right or wrong, there has to be some sort of a clear-cut action that, resulted in the in whatever the result was that is either right or wrong. Consider the promotion of happiness and diminishing human suffering, which is basically central to many of the ethical systems, particularly utilitarianism, right? Self-interest, like I said, is not inherently unethical, but it can be very unethical if it is done at the expense of others. Again, if you're using unjust means that can be harmful to others, even if the end result is something positive, you might want to consider not engaging in that action, right? And so when we talked about different types of professional ethics and things like that, research ethics really emphasizes the notion that individuals are not to be used as the means to achieve some sort of an end, even if that end is positive, right? And this comes from, really nasty historical context, right? The Nuremberg codes, which kind of established worldwide principles on research ethics, stemmed from the Nuremberg trials, which followed World War II, where a number of prominent Nazi leaders and Nazi scientists were put on trial for crimes against humanity. Um, you know, while some of their actions did develop some positive results, I mean, some of the techniques that we use in treating hypothermia and things like that come from horrible, horrible actions like taking prisoners of war, and Jews and people of the Roma population, putting them into freezing conditions so that hypothermia sets in, seeing if there's a way that we can bring up their body temperatures back to normal levels, right? That was developed by Nazi scientists, but the means by which they came to those kinds of conclusions is not something that is deemed to be socially acceptable, right? Also, consider human nature and try to develop a system of moral decision making that's informed by thought, an image of fulfilled human potential, as well as both an awareness and motivation to be a moral person, right? So think, self-reflect as much as possible. Think about what it is to be a fulfilled human being. Think about what it is to live a good life. This is essentially what the ancient Greeks were talking about: Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. How do we live a good life? Well, a big part of that is to establish a moral code that is aware of what morality ultimately is, and that you have individuals that are indeed motivated to achieve those kinds of principles and live a good life as a moral person. Okay, so that about sums it up as far as the material for this session. Thank you very much for listening to it, and I hope to see you again in an upcoming video.